Hi, this is Steve Michelotti of the Azure Government Engineering team. I'm joined here today by Harshal Dharia, a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. Welcome, Harshal.
Thank you, Steve.
So today we are going to be talking about open source DevOps on Azure Government. So why don't you give us just an introduction here about what are the types of things that we want to think about here and what are the type of concepts that we are going to talk about?
Absolutely. So we're talking about open source DevOps. So that different flavors of DevOps. First of all, we have our own tool set, but mainly what we're talking about is open source for perspective. The idea, again, from a perspective of what our customers are doing, is they want something that is completely open source, mainly from a cloud agnostic nature.
Yep.
What we're looking for is something that is modern and that's proven for various things. So a lot of our customers have already started to embrace cloud, and they're already doing something for on-prem, and they want to actually use the same tool sets and move it into Azure. So how can they actually do that in a way where they can actually use the same tool sets for not only on-prem, maybe for Azure, or maybe for another cloud provider?
So they can use their existing tool sets, move it into Azure, in fact, Azure Government, and run their build process on a high compliance environment.
Exactly. So when we're talking about open source tools, we're talking about basically using the same tools from different providers, right? You usually, when you actually talk to customers, they've already picked a couple of tools. So if you're talking about like a CI/CD pipeline or Devops pipeline in general, you have your basic tools. Like say, for example, from a developer perspective, you're using Eclipse, which is a great open source IDE. From a version management system, you're using GitHub. From a CI/CD process, you're using Jenkins as your biggest orchestrator. You have other tools like Packer to kind of make your images. We'll talk more in detail about that. And then from a deployment purposes, you're either using Jenkins as your orchestration engine, or maybe something else to actually kind of like do the deployment into your dev test prod environment. But again, the main gist is when you actually do open source DevOps, you can actually kind of like use the same tool sets and then just change it up a little bit, and use the same things for multiple environments.
And I'm finding a couple interesting things in what you're saying. One is, obviously, we at Microsoft love tools like GitHub.
Exactly.
But also, not only can you use your existing tools, but you can use tools that are agnostic.
Exactly.
And the fact that I heard you mention Terraform in there, and that's
right.
a tool that actually some of our biggest customers in Azure use to be able
right.
to do things in an agnostic way.
Absolutely, you brought up a very good point. So basically, Terraform is a multi-cloud strategy with that, right? So basically, a lot of our customers may be talking about like provisioning infrastructure within Azure, within on-prem, or within other cloud providers. You want to talk about basically an agnostic tool that just works. So for example, if you look at it, a lot of our customers are actually moving to infrastructure as code.
Yes.
So basically, the idea is no longer are you going in and actually going into the portal, going into things, and actually configuring things manually, but you're actually using scripts to configure your infrastructure. And if you're doing that, then why not actually be able to do that? So Terraform provides a couple of basic options for us. It allows you to import in existing infrastructure into scripts. It actually has support for both Windows and Linux. And then the biggest thing that, from my perspective, is actually allows you to plan your changes into a cloud service provider before you can actually make those changes. And we'll showcase that a little bit.
What's interesting is, as you're talking about Terraform, is in some ways there's a lot of similarities to what we have as ARM,
right.
Azure Resource Manager, and
exactly.
Azure. But what's really cool about Terraform is you can do it in this agnostic way, which is really nice. You could do it for Azure. You could even use Terraform in AWS.
Exactly. And the biggest thing or biggest myth is, like, hey, I can actually have a script from Terraform that actually works for cloud service provider A, and I can use that script. That's not the case. The idea what Terraform will provide is the same syntax.
Yeah.
It's like, think about a programming language. If you use .NET Code or Java or something, that syntax does not change if you're doing business logic A or business logic B.
Yep.
The idea is that the syntax stays the same. You just tweak what the code's doing, and that's what Terraform brings to it.
Very
you don't
cool.
have to learn a completely new language from it.
Yep.
So let's quickly deep dive into Terraform.
Okay.
So basically, what you're looking at right now is basically a script that I've written in Terraform. So now, since we're talking about Azure Government, Terraform makes it very easy to do the integration with government. So basically, from a perspective of Terraform, what Terraform provides is this Azure RM module. That module has a tag called environment, and the only thing you change it is to do US government. Once you change it to US government, it basically talks to all the government endpoints that we have.
Right.
So basically now what this script does that I have right now is basically provisions a VM and installs Docker CE on it. So that's all the script does. It's a single VM. As a matter of fact, if you look at it, it's actually provisioning a standard DS4 V2 VM. So I've actually already taken the trouble and done that. So a couple of things that Terraform actually provides. If you just do Terraform just now, it actually has a couple of commands. Once you have the scripts done, the first thing that you do is you do Terraform Apply.
Yep.
The Terraform Apply actually does basically provisions your infrastructure. I've already done the infrastructure, but the main thing that you can actually do is, how about if I go back actually.
And the Terraform Apply will just run that script that you just showed us a second ago.
Exactly. So I'm going to go ahead and change that script instead of saying, you know what, I don't want a DS4 VM, I want a DS2 VM, right? So once I go ahead and do that, I can just say Terraform plan. And what it's doing right now, so Terraform is really good for knowing is actually keeping state in memory on your workstation. So right now, what it basically did was actually went into Azure, it compared your infrastructure and said, what changes are you making? And as you can see right there, it says, hey, I'm changing the VM sizes from a DS4 to a DS2 V2. And as soon as I do Terraform Apply, it will go ahead and make those changes for me. And then for me to actually go ahead and after those changes are done, I can go ahead and just say Terraform destroy. And once that is done, the infrastructure will be gone. So basically, it will look through everything. It will say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and delete all these following items. And it will just say yes. So I'm not going to go ahead and do that right now. But basically, those are the three main commands that you need to do in Terraform. From an integration from an Azure Government perspective, it's literally one tag that you need to change for it to work with Azure Government.
That's awesome. So it's a Terraform script, but it really allows you to do this in a declarative way.
Exactly.
Infrastructure as code, as you mentioned.
Exactly. So the whole idea from a DevOps perspective is you have actually a set defined way of actually defining your infrastructure, and you have checked your scripts into your version repository management system, so you know exactly what your infrastructure looks like. So you don't have to worry about no more, hey, worked in dev does not work in test and production.
Right.
That's what this issue resolves.
Very good.
So we just basically talked about Terraform. Terraform being a really good infrastructure as code tool. The next tool, as when you start talking about open source DevOps, the biggest tool that comes to mind is Jenkins. Now, Jenkins has a long history. I believe it's been in the market for about 10, 12 years
At least,
plus.
if not more.
And now there's actually enterprise support for Jenkins available through other providers. But Jenkins, as a matter of fact, like if you talk about from an open source perspective, it's actually running on Azure. So you can see how much investment that we are making from our perspective to actually get Jenkins support on Azure. So I want to quickly walk you through the Azure Portal in government and see what we have actually in there.
All right, sounds good. Let's do it.
So let me walk you through Jenkins basically in Azure Portal. So as you can see, I'm actually logged into Microsoft Azure Government, and this is basically the portal. If you actually go in and actually search in the marketplace, and if you just type in Jenkins, what you will see is a Microsoft-sponsored image, a template that we actually have, basically for U.S. government.
And you can see US Gov right there.
Right there. And it's actually running on Ubuntu. It actually comes pre-installed with all the Azure's plugin that we provide within Jenkins. And once you go through the guide.
So it makes it super easy to provision everything on Azure Gov.
Exactly. So you just kind of basically follow the walkthrough. And then once you actually have done, you actually have a Jenkins infrastructure up and running. So I've actually gone through the trouble of actually doing that, and I have my Jenkins environment up and running. It looks very similar to what we do with open source Jenkins. It is open source Jenkins. As a matter of fact, you can still have SSH access into the box and everything. What you see from your perspective is, let me walk you through a couple of the plugins that we actually have. So again, Jenkins, the big drive behind Jenkins is the open plugin ecosystem that it has. So if you go into the manage plugins, and again, I have to do a plugin updates, but if you go into and say, it says what's installed, and if I just search for Azure, let me just zoom in. So what you see is a couple of plugins that are actually Azure specific. So like say the first plugin, Azure AD plugin, that actually allows you to actually integrate Jenkins with the Azure Identity Management. So Azure Active Directory. So if you don't want to use your credentials to actually log into Azure and actually just want to use your Active Directory credentials, you can do that.
So we already talked about being in a super secure environment and a compliant environment, but the fact that you can use Azure Active Directory gives you even a higher level of security.
Exactly. So you can do that. I believe Azure App Service. App Service is basically a huge, the biggest platform as a service tool that we provide for actually hosting your web applications. And Azure App Service plugin actually allows it, makes it easy for you to do deployments into that.
Right.
So we're talking about basically integrating services or integrating native services that are running on Azure with open source tools. These are one of the things. As we kind of like navigate down, you see the Azure CLI plugin. So that's one way of interacting with Azure. I showed you guys the portal earlier. Basically, CLI has a command line interface.
Yep.
And you can actually integrate with that from Jenkins directly into it. Kubernetes is another big one. So a lot of these plugins I'm talking about not only work with our commercial version of Azure, but also work really great with government. And as a matter of fact, everything that I'm showing you is running in government.
Nice.
And then if you keep on going, I think the biggest plugin to me that makes the biggest sense is basically Azure VM agents. So if you talk about Jenkins, it can get very cumbersome to actually manage the cluster. Azure VM agents provides you the ability to have the scale. We're talking about big compute. So basically, based on load, it will go ahead and provision a VM. It will add it to your Jenkins cluster, so you have enough resources to actually do your builds.
Makes sense.
And then when the time comes, it will actually go ahead and deprovision this VM, so you're not exactly paying for things that you don't need.
Elastic scale of the
Elastic
cloud.
scale of the cloud within Jenkins.
And I always say, not just scaling up, but scaling down is just as important because you can save money.
Exactly, and that's what this does. Another big plugin to talk about is the Azure Credentials plugin. Now, one way of interacting with any cloud provider is to store credentials, which should basically be service principal tokens or user IDs and password. Azure Credentials actually makes it a secure way of actually storing these credentials in Jenkins itself.
Yeah.
And so you never actually have to rely on user ID and passwords within your scripts and things like that. And it makes it much more secure for you to interact with Azure.
Right. You know, as I'm listening to you describe all these features, I'm really struck by the fact that anyone could just go and spin up a VM in Azure and manually install this stuff. But the fact that the Jenkins ecosystem, which is already very rich, has all these really first-class citizens, these plugins and hooks into Azure, really makes it a great experience.
Exactly. And then the biggest drive is these plugins are not only supported by the open source community, but they're supported by Microsoft engineers.
Definitely.
We actually have a dedicated engineering team that actually works on these plugins and actually provides support and enhancements to these plugins. So you know, from a Microsoft perspective, we are actually heavily invested in open source community.
Definitely. All right, cool. All right, so should we talk about the pipeline itself?
So one of the main seconds that one of the main reasons that you install Jenkins, because Jenkins is the biggest orchestration engine. Right? It orchestrates your CI/CD pipeline. So what I have is I have basically two pipelines. The first pipeline right now is basically an IaaS pipeline. So when we talk about cloud in general, the biggest principle of cloud is immutable infrastructure. So if you recall, basically what we did on-prem, we kind of spin up a VM, and if you want to release a new software on the VM, you go into our RDP or SSH into the VM and configure your VM all over again. What that takes the ability to do is go ahead and revert back to a previous version or make quick fixes to it, right? It kind of makes it really hard for you to release quickly on a weekly basis or on a daily basis. One way of doing this is basically using a DevOps pipeline. So what you see on the screen right now is basically a DevOps pipeline that's basically solely based on IaaS, so infrastructure as a service. So say you have a customer who's using our version of basically VM scale sets. So basically that's a way of actually scaling VMs based on load behind the scenes. And then so how do you actually update your VM scale sets with a new version of software? You don't really want to go in and actually RDP into every single VM. You need a better way of actually doing that.
Right.
So one way of doing that is basically using Jenkins to do that. So in this case, what you see is, say you're a developer who commits code into your repository. Now this could be enterprise GitHub, GitLab, however you want to call it. And then you use Jenkins to go ahead and do a build. So we do a build within Jenkins. In my case, I'm actually going to do a build. I'm actually going to use a Docker container to wrap my build around. So I wrap it in, and I actually go ahead and push my container into an Azure Container Registry. Now, this is a new service that was just released into Azure Government. It's basically, if you think about Azure Container Registry, it basically provides you a repository to store your container images in a much more scalable fashion where you don't have to manage storage. It's geo-replicable. So it's actually you can actually host your container registry in the regions where you're actually deploying your containers. So you don't have to be thinking about basically, hey, I'm going to have my container registry in Virginia, but I'm going to have my containers running in Arizona.
So if you don't want to use some publicly accessible registry for your containers,
Exactly.
you can have a registry in your high compliance Azure Gov environment.
Exactly.
Private to you.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's great. And this works out pretty well because now you can actually have your Jenkins environment running in Azure, pushing and building containers directly within Azure itself. So So the next step after you have your containers built is go ahead and test it out. Because again, what you did was you just basically created an artifact. So what I'm doing is I'm actually using Jenkins to go ahead and push off my container to my dev environment. And this dev environment was actually created by the Terraform script I showed you guys earlier.
Yep.
So within that, then once I do that, then we want to talk about Packer a bit. Packer is a really great way to actually bake a VM. The idea is actually rather than actually creating a container, I'm actually baking the whole OS disk. And then I'm actually going to use that OS disk to update the VM scale set.
As the basis of the VM scale set.
Exactly.
So I think this is a really important takeaway that we should just double click on for a second. Rather than creating a Docker container that gets built by your CI/CD pipeline, and then having to deploy it 10 times in 10 different VMs, essentially what you're doing is creating the container, putting it on a VM, you're baking the VM to use your term, and then that VM image can simply just be used as the basis for your VM scale sets. You don't have to deploy the code 10 times, you deploy it once, and here's the baseline VM image that you can spin up with your VM scale set.
You got it absolutely right. So again, I'm back in the Jenkins environment that we were earlier. So as you can see, this is again the same environment that we were in earlier. What I have right now is I have two pipelines. One is basically a Docker pipeline for IaaS, and actually I have a pipeline running already. But let me walk you through the other pipeline. I also want to kind of highlight this new view that you actually be able to see. So Jenkins actually did a cosmetic update, and they released something called Blue Ocean. So this is basically a pipeline that's actually a view that's intended to actually visualize pipeline.
So that the little graphic we see at the top of the screen sort of corresponds to the PowerPoint you just showed.
Exactly. So basically, and then all of this is coming from what we call, so we talked about infrastructure as code earlier. Now there's a new concept within Jenkins called build as code. So basically there's a script file that I have that actually defines how to build, how to do things, and that I injected into my code base already.
Is that script file like a YAML file or something along those lines?
It's not quite a YAML file. Let me show it to you. Here is a sample script file that I have right now. So what you can see is basically has a bunch of syntax on it, and all this script is doing is basically checking out the source code, exactly what we're talking about, right? So basically it's checking out the source code, it's building it, it's pushing it directly into the container registry and deploying it to Docker VM. But basically the idea is that now I have my build definition embedded with my code. So if my version A requires a different build definition, then I can modify my build definition accordingly.
So therefore it's source controlled along with everything else.
Exactly. So because not every version of your software needs to be built the same way, and needs to be tested the same way.
Right.
So this is what we're talking about up here. So going back into Jenkins, what you see is basically I've actually created a pipeline build, and that actually goes ahead and actually builds everything. So what you see is if I go into the build process, it actually goes in and actually tags, downloads the source code. It's tagging it, and it's actually pushing it. So if you look it up here, let me zoom in. Actually, it's pushing it directly into the Azure Container Registry that's running in Azure Government. And it's actually creating different versions. So let's say that's 51, and that's actually the latest version right there.
Yep.
Once it does that, going back up, again, so in this case, what I'm doing is, so now you actually have couple different options. So my option up here was, okay, I can go ahead and integrate this with Terraform and actually provision my dev environment on the fly, and then actually deploy my version of my new Docker container or my new dev code into it, and then deprovision my environment. What I'm doing in this case is actually allocating and deallocating the VM. So remember, in Azure, once you actually provision a VM, if you deallocate the VM, you're not paying as much as when you have the VM up and running. Again, the whole idea is that you pay for what you use in Azure Government.
Right. I see you're using the Azure CLI.
Exactly. So I'm actually using the Azure CLI plugin to actually invoke an Azure CLI command. And as you can see, I'm actually using the credentials. Yep. Plugin to actually inject in the username and the service principal token into it without actually you being able to see it.
Yes.
So now it's a secret that I'm injecting into it, so you can actually you don't actually see the actual tokens. Once you do that, then basically I'm going to go ahead and actually do SSH. So now SSH is your friend up here. We actually have a public keys, trusted public keys between the two machines, so I can actually invoke SSH commands into it. So in this case right now, I'm actually going in and actually deploying my Docker container that I actually pushed into an AACR. So what it's doing is actually going into SSHing into the VM, and you can see right there that I'm actually doing a Docker run.
Yep.
And actually pointing it to the latest container that I actually did. So once that is done, it's going to wait. It's going to say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and wait for you to approve the build. So this gives us, the developers, the chance to actually go into a dev environment
this point,
and verify the code.
At this point, it is an Azure Container Registry.
Right. At this point, it's an Azure Container Registry and everything, and then it's actually deployed to the dev machine that we actually already deployed using Terraform.
Okay.
So after that is done, the idea again is I don't need the VM anymore.
Yeah.
So why pay for it?
Right.
So now I have the option to actually do either deallocate the VM using Azure CLI or do a Terraform destroy. Basically, I don't need the resources anymore. Again, remember, the idea is, again, immutable infrastructure.
Yes.
So we don't really need the infrastructure if we don't need to use it. So that's what it's doing, is basically just making sure the VM is turned off, so we're not exactly going to pay for it.
Right.
And then after that, since we have verified that the resource is done, it's going to initiate the baking process.
And we can see right there, approved by Harshal.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's approved by me.
Okay.
So the biggest thing that you see in baking is right up here. Is basically, again, let's go back into Jenkins. So I actually have a script as on the pipeline that's running. Now the baking process, what it's doing is actually doing multiple things. It's actually, again, when we talk about Terraform, we saw how the script was laid out, actually provisioning the VM and everything. That's exactly what this is based on. So if I go back into my script, this is basically what you see on the screen right now is basically a Packer script.
Okay, so this is what's baking my VM, adding the Docker container that contains my app.
Exactly. So what you see is basically it's a builder that actually we provide. And again, you will see something like the U.S. government, integration with Azure U.S. government. So that's the only thing that you need to change. And what I provide is I provide a bunch of information, basically service principal tokens and everything. I say what kind of VM I want, and I say what kind of where to pull the container from. So in this case right there, it's actually putting the container, and it's actually going in and actually sys-prepping the VM so I can use it later on.
All right, sounds good.
So once that is done, so basically if I go back into Jenkins, if I hit proceed, it's going to initiate the baking process. And then this takes 15 minutes to actually go ahead and actually provision the VM, install all the software, configure it, and bake it. But once it's baked, what you will see is if you go back into the Azure portal, once it's baked, it actually goes ahead and actually creates a managed disk or managed image in here. So then so if you see, it says 47, 49, 50, 51.
That's the build number?
That's the build number.
Wow, nice.
So that's the image that it actually uses. Okay. So now I can go back into Jenkins and I can say, once this is done, I can go ahead and say, hey, I verified my VM, everything is good, I have my VM done. Now why don't you go ahead and update the scale set that I have running and use the new image. So remember, when you go into the scale set, right? So what this script does basically just says, okay, I went ahead and I said, I got the count of how many instances that I have to upload, and it does a for loop and basically does a rolling update of the VMs in the scale set, so you don't have any disruptions in your traffic.
Nice. So no downtime.
So basically no downtime. And if you have your health checks configured properly, then your load balancer will make sure that if a node goes unhealthy, it will take it out and then put it back in.
And if there's a few seconds where it's deploying, we don't want to get requests during those few seconds.
Exactly. So it's basically just going in and actually doing a rolling upgrade right there. So the idea, again, is if you go back into Azure Portal, and if you go into the VM scale set, what you will see is all the VMs that are within the scale set are all updated from 51 to 52. In a matter of a few minutes.
Nice. Okay, cool. So this is an awesome example of IaaS.
Right.
You mentioned that you can also do a similar thing with PaaS?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about IaaS, right? So now, a lot of our customers are still using IaaS, but a lot of our customers are also moving into PaaS. So we're talking about PaaS. We're talking about mainly we're talking about Azure Web Apps. So when we're talking about Azure Web Apps, Azure Web Apps actually makes it very much easier for you to kind of like manage your deployments, and it takes the whole hassle of managing infrastructure away from it.
Even this diagram is simpler.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So as you can see, the differences between the IaaS diagram and this, it's much simpler to do that, and mainly because of the plugin that we provide. We provide a plugin called for Azure App Service that actually allows you to directly do a deployment directly into your Azure PaaS environment.
Nice.
So let's go back into Jenkins. So you guys can see the build still going on. I'm going to quickly deviate and then talk about the web app that we have. So here's the web app that we have. I'm going to go back into into the pipeline. So you can see this pipeline is already running. I'm going to see if I can find one that I've already ran before.
Yep.
But again, what you will see is this pipeline is going to be much simpler. It's not going to require a lot of steps for you to kind of like do a deployment code. This pipeline is all about basically just checking out your source code. In this case, I'm just checking out my source code from my GitHub repo. I'm going to go ahead and do my build and go ahead and do a dev. So when I do a publish, you will see basically it's just doing a git push. So remember, there's one of the many ways of deploying a new code into an Azure web app is Git.
So this is Git hosted Azure.
Exactly.
Or I should say Azure hosted Git.
Exactly. So it actually basically exposes a Git repo with an Azure web app, and you can actually do a push command to it. And that's exactly what this plugin does. It actually does a Git push directly into the Azure web app. So all I'm doing is basically that. So downloading source code from one Git repo and pushing it directly into another Git repo.
Okay.
And once that is done, I'm basically just stopping and then say, hey, can I verify my code? So basically the whole idea is like, okay, here's my dev environment, and I'm just making sure I'm verifying it. Once it's verified, I'll go ahead and do the production deployment. So now in production, you have multiple cases. We tend to tell people to use basically what we call deployment slots, so you can swap things.
You could deploy to a staging slot, make sure it's good
exactly
in production before you swap.
So the whole idea is it makes the idea of reverting to prior changes better, much easier. So in this case, I can do the exact same thing. I can go into my build. I can basically say go into back to my output. I'm just going to say, you know what? Go ahead and deploy it to my production environment. And you can see how easy that deployment works through. So again, from a development perspective, the only thing that you have done is basically checked in your code into your version management system, and then basically configured the Jenkins pipeline. And once all that is done, it's an automated process. You have a CI/CD pipeline, completely open source, that takes your code from your entry-level dev environment all the way to production.
Nice. Okay, cool. So we saw lots of examples here. Yeah. We saw an IaaS example where you use containers and Azure Container Registry. We saw a PaaS example where you're going directly to Azure websites. Some really cool stuff using open source technologies in your DevOps pipeline on Azure Government. Okay. Well, thanks a lot. This has been Steve Michelotti with Harshal Dharia talking about open source DevOps on Azure Government. Thanks for watching.